Next, we are going to be exploring several specific cultural identities. We can get a better understanding of current cultural identities by unpacking how they came to be, and by recognizing that oftentimes these cultural identities are constructed for various political and social reasons. We're going to start this discussion by looking at race as a cultural identity. Race is a socially constructed category that is based on differences in appearance that has been used to create hierarchies that privilege some and disadvantage others. When we talk about race being socially constructed, this means that race doesn't have meaning until we assign meaning to it, similar to how words don't have meaning until we assign meaning to them. The sole fact that someone's skin is a different color than ours doesn't mean anything until we construct meaning around it. And when Western Europeans traveled to parts of the world that were previously unknown to them, they encountered people who were different from them. And these lighter-skinned Europeans placed themselves above darker-skinned people and called them less evolved and savages. And these distinctions, like I was saying, were based mostly on differences in appearance, and these distinctions are based largely on phenotypes. Phenotypes are the physiological features such as skin color, hair texture, and other body and facial features. And these distinctions help to justify things like colonial expansion, enslavement, genocide, and other forms of exploitation on massive scales. Now, within the United States, we have several racial groups that are living in this country. We have African Americans, Asian Americans, European Americans, Latinx people, Native Americans, and so on and so forth. And each of these groups can be broken down even further. For example, someone who is Latinx might be Mexican or El Salvadorian or any number of different countries of origin. And in addition to the fact that we have these different racial groups that we try to categorize people into, this can lead to generalizations among these groups, which can often lead to stereotypes as well. Within this discussion of racial groups, we also have to talk about the labels that we use to describe different racial groups. For example, there is discussion about whether we should use the term African American, Black, or people of color. And as of right now, there's a lot of talk that Black is the current politically correct, quote unquote, terminology to use to describe that racial group. When I was growing up, the correct term was African American. And when I say correct term, I mean politically correct with significant air quotes around that. But the labels that we use change and develop over time. And it's important to do your research and know what is correct for right now, what people identify as right now. Similarly, with the terms Latin American, Latina, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, there are preferences that different individuals have within these racial groups about how they refer to themselves. For example, a lot of people will tell you that the term Hispanic is now outdated because it doesn't properly describe the group of people that it's trying to describe. The term Hispanic means of Spanish origin, whereas Latinx, Latina, or Latino describes people who come from Central America. And similarly with Native Americans. For the longest time, we referred to Native Americans as Indians because when Christopher Columbus came to America and encountered these people, he thought that he was in India and incorrectly called them Indian, and the name stuck. But more recently, we have shifted our language use to describe these groups. So the best thing that you can do if you are ever uncertain about the language that you can use or that you should use is to do your research, right? So just go to Google, type things in, start reading information about racial groups and racial identities, and have conversations as well. If someone tells you that they refer to themselves as Black, then that's the label that they use, and you should honor that. So, in addition, we have to talk about interracial communication, because we're talking about race in relation to how it affects communication. And race and communication are related in various different ways. Racism influences our communication about race, and it's not an easy topic for most people to discuss. This brings us to an important distinction between racist acts and institutional racism. Racist acts are things that are done by individuals, whereas institutional racism are racist patterns and practices that go through societal institutions. So these are things that are widespread within our society. And this also brings us to the idea of code switching, because so often dominant groups tend to define what is quote unquote correct and incorrect usage of language. And so, as a result, a lot of people who come from different racial groups have to engage in this concept of code switching, where they change from one way of speaking to another, and between or within interactions. And generally speaking, this code switching happens when the individual is communicating with dominant group members. And usually, this code switching happens because the individual fears being negatively judged. This code switching might be a literal language switch, where somebody might speak Spanish at home but speak English when they are at school. Or it could just be a switch in the way that someone speaks or the mannerisms that they use in different contexts. It's as though you are one person with one group of people and a completely different person with another group. So as you can see, our race as a cultural identity has a significant impact on the way that we communicate with others, even though at the end of the day, race is this thing that is socially constructed and socially agreed upon by our society. It still has a really significant impact on how people communicate with one another.